She sat at her vanity, 1954, the heavy glass jar of cold cream cool against her palm, and every trick she used that morning cost her absolutely nothing. These tricks vanished, but every single one still works today. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The average American woman in the 1950s owned somewhere between 30 and 36 garments total, not 30 dresses. 30 to 36 pieces of clothing, everything included. And yet photographs from that era show women who look put together in a way that takes real effort to explain. The polish was not coming from abundance. It was coming from something else entirely. A set of habits, so ingrained they were invisible. In 1950, American families spent roughly 11.5% of their annual income on clothing and shoes. Today, that number sits below 3%. Read that again slowly, because it changes how you understand everything that comes next. When a dress represented a genuine financial sacrifice, you did not let it pill or fade or wrinkle into irrelevance. You learned every trick that existed to protect it. Preservation was not a hobby, it was an economic obligation, and the women who practiced it were protecting real money. By 1954, something quietly remarkable had happened in American women's magazines. Publications like McCall's and Ladies' Home Journal simply stopped printing the basic clothing care and beauty tips that had filled their pages for decades. Not because the tips stopped working, because the editors assumed every woman reading already knew them. The knowledge had passed so thoroughly from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, that printing it felt redundant. That assumption turned out to be the beginning of the end for all of it. Today, the average American woman owns more than 100 garments, more than 3 times what her grandmother considered a complete wardrobe, and yet most of us would struggle to say our closets make us feel more put together. What happened in the space between then and now is not just a change in how much we own. It is a change in what we know how to do with what we own. 25 specific tricks disappeared, quietly, one generation at a time, and every single one of them still works. The first trick is cold cream, and it is older than the 1950s, but it reached its peak in that decade for a reason. The routine was simple. Before bed, a woman would scoop a small amount of cold cream from that heavy glass jar and work it gently across her face, dissolving the day's lipstick and powder in oil rather than scrubbing it away with a foaming cleanser. The cream lifted everything without stripping anything. A soft tissue removed it all. No water required. The skin was left with its own natural oils intact. The reason cold cream worked so well comes down to a principle that modern dermatology has spent years rediscovering. Oil dissolves oil. The makeup, the sunscreen, the environmental residue sitting on the skin. All of it is oil-based, and cold cream lifts it away without touching the skin's own moisture barrier. Harsh foaming cleansers, by contrast, strip everything indiscriminately, and the skin spends the rest of the night trying to compensate by overproducing oil. The 1950s woman was not doing anything primitive. She was doing something chemically intelligent. Joan Crawford was not known for sharing beauty secrets, but this one got out. Every morning she plunged her face into a bowl filled with ice water, not splashed. Plunged, fully submerged for a few seconds, then lifted. Housewives across the country read about it and quietly adopted it because it cost nothing and required nothing except a bowl and some ice from the icebox. It was a Hollywood trick that traveled into ordinary kitchens and ordinary vanity tables, and it worked just as well on a Tuesday morning in Ohio as it did on a film set in California. The science behind the ice plunge is straightforward, and modern dermatologists have confirmed it without hesitation. Cold water causes blood vessels near the surface of the skin to constrict rapidly. That constriction reduces the puffiness that accumulates overnight from fluid pooling in facial tissue while you sleep. The effect is immediate and visible, and it costs exactly nothing. No serum, no eye cream, no refrigerated roller. A bowl of ice water from the kitchen did in 30 seconds what a shelf full of modern products promises to do over 30 days. The third trick requires a complete shift in how we think about hair care, because the 1950s approach was almost the opposite of what we do today. Those elaborate waves and curls you see in photographs were not styled fresh every morning. They were set once a week, one dedicated evening with pin curls or rollers, one night under a scarf, and then the entire week was spent preserving that set, not recreating it. The daily routine was a maintenance routine, not a styling routine. That distinction changed everything about how much time and money a woman spent on her hair. The preservation system was built around one key tool, a silk scarf. After the pin curls were set, a woman would fold the scarf into a triangle, lay it over the entire head, and tie it under the chin with a loose knot. The silk created almost no friction against the hair, which meant the curls held their shape through a full night of sleep. Cotton pillowcases, by contrast, create enough friction to fuzz and flatten a set in a matter of hours. The silk scarf was not a fashion accessory in this context. It was a precision tool for protecting a week's worth of work. The fourth trick is one that sounds almost too simple to be real, but the women who practiced it were doing something that modern trichologists, hair scientists, have since confirmed has genuine merit. 100 brush strokes each night, working from the scalp down to the ends. Not a casual run-through, but a deliberate, methodical distribution of the scalp's natural oils down the full length of the hair shaft. The oil produced at the roots is the same oil the ends need for moisture and shine. The brush was the delivery system, and it cost nothing to use. Consider what this brushing ritual was quietly replacing. In the 1950s, women spent the modern equivalent of just a few dollars a year on all hair products combined. Shampoo happened once a week at most, sometimes less. There were no leave-in conditioners, no heat protectants, no shine serums. The hair still looked healthy and lustrous in photograph after photograph. The brushing technique was doing the work of an entire product shelf. Scalp oil is not a problem to be shampooed away daily. It is a resource, and the 1950s woman knew exactly how to use it. The fifth trick lived in the sewing kit, and almost nobody outside of that generation would think to look for a beauty or clothing trick there. When a bar of soap wore down to a thin sliver too small to hold in the bath, it was not thrown away. It was set aside to dry completely, then placed in the sewing basket. That dried soap sliver became a perfect marking tool for dark fabrics. Wool, navy serge, black crepe, where white tailor's chalk would show but pencil would not wash out. The soap marked cleanly, held its line, and disappeared entirely in the first wash. The reason this trick vanished is almost painfully obvious once you see it. Disposable culture arrived and made saving soap slivers feel like the behavior of someone who could not afford to buy more soap. The social signal flipped. Thrift went from being a sign of intelligence to being a sign of poverty, and a whole category of practical knowledge went with it. But the trick itself never stopped working. A dried soap sliver still marks dark fabric cleanly. The marks still vanish in the wash. The chemistry did not change. Only the willingness to bother with it did. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew. The soap sliver did not live in a recipe book or a magazine column. It lived in the sewing kit, passed from a mother's hands to a daughter's hands during an afternoon of mending, mentioned once and never mentioned again, because once was enough. That is how most of these tricks traveled. Not through publication, not through instruction, but through proximity and repetition. A woman watching another woman work, absorbing the method without ever being formally taught it. The knowledge was alive as long as the chain held. The sixth trick is the penny in the hem, and it is one of the most quietly ingenious things I have come across in all of this research. One single penny, sewn invisibly into the inner hem of a lightweight circle skirt, acted as a weight that kept the skirt falling straight and close to the body in the wind. No one looking at the skirt would ever see it or feel it. It added almost no weight to the garment, but it changed the behavior of the fabric entirely, turning a skirt that could embarrass a woman on a breezy street corner into one that moved with dignity. Women in windy cities like Chicago and New York were the first to adopt this trick widely, and it is not hard to understand why. Christian Dior's new look had arrived in American closets by the late 1940s, bringing those full, sweeping circle skirts that were beautiful in a still photograph and occasionally mortifying on a city sidewalk. The penny trick was the practical answer to a very real and very public problem. It cost 1 cent. It required 5 minutes and a needle and thread, and it meant a woman could walk down Michigan Avenue without a second thought about the wind. The seventh trick is about the Dior silhouette, and it gets at something essential about how 1950s women related to fashion. When the new look arrived with its nipped waist and full skirt, it created an immediate desire that most American household budgets simply could not satisfy. So women found a free solution. They tied their blouses, a cotton blouse tucked and knotted at the front hem or tied at the back, cinched the waist instantly, and created the nipped silhouette without requiring a single new purchase. It was fashion adaptation as a domestic skill, and it worked beautifully. The historical anchor here matters. In 1947, Christian Dior introduced the new look in Paris, and it landed in American culture like a dropped stone in still water, sending ripples into every women's magazine, every department store window, every conversation between neighbors over the back fence. American homemakers wanted that silhouette. They just were not going to spend money they did not have to get it. What followed was a decade of quiet, inventive adaptation, women taking what they already owned and reshaping it, retying it, rebelting it to meet the moment. The new look became the new resourcefulness. She had one dress she loved above all others, a navy crepe with a fitted bodice that she had saved 3 months of grocery money to buy in the spring of 1953. And yet her neighbors never once saw her wear the same dress twice, or so it seemed. The secret was not a new wardrobe. It was one belt swapped for another, a brooch pinned at the collar 1 week and at the hip the next, a silk scarf tucked inside the neckline the week after that. The dress itself never changed. Everything around it did. When women today talk about a capsule wardrobe, they are describing something 1950s homemakers already lived without ever naming it. A single dress worn 50 times across a decade looked perpetually fresh because the accessories carried all the visual weight of change. The belt drew the eye to the waist one Sunday. A collar pin redirected attention upward the next. The dress itself became a quiet background, a canvas that never competed with the story the accessories were telling. It was not thrift. It was considered deliberate style intelligence. There is a trick so simple it sounds almost too small to matter, and yet it was one of the most reliable signals of a well-kept post-war home. A stiff, freshly starched collar on a dress that had been worn a dozen times told every eye in the room that this woman had not let things slide. The collar was the first thing people saw. If it was crisp, the whole garment read as new. If it was limp, nothing else you wore could rescue the impression. 1950s homemakers understood this geometry of attention completely. The process itself took less than 2 minutes and cost almost nothing. A light mist of liquid starch, mixed at home from a box that cost a few cents, was sprayed onto the collar while the iron heated. The iron came down firm and slow, working from the points inward so the collar never puckered. 1 pass, maybe 2, and the fabric went from soft and tired to sharp and authoritative. Women did this without thinking, the way you might straighten a picture frame as you pass it in the hall. It was reflex, not effort. Here is something that sounds almost fussy until you understand the economics behind it. In a closet where every garment represented a meaningful portion of the family income, 1950s women stored each piece with exactly 1 inch of breathing room on either side, not 2 inches, not pressed tight against its neighbor, 1 inch. That single inch of air between hangers meant fabric could hang freely, seams could relax back into their original lines, and the garment arrived on the body looking rested rather than exhausted. It was a rule so precise it must have been taught deliberately. Walk into almost any modern closet, and you will see the opposite of this. Garments crushed together so tightly you have to use 2 hands to pull one free, sleeves folded permanently against neighboring fabric, collars bent into shapes they were never meant to hold. The average American woman now owns more than 100 garments, and most of them live in conditions that guarantee they will look tired before they are ever truly worn out. The 1950s woman with her 36 pieces and her 1 inch of breathing room per hanger was, by any practical measure, getting far more from what she owned. Nylon stockings in the 1950s were not cheap and they were not sturdy. A single snag could end a pair's useful life, and replacing them cost real money in a household where clothing already consumed 11.5 cents of every dollar earned. So, women developed a ritual that happened the moment they came through the door in the evening. Off came the shoes, off came the stockings, and immediately, before anything else, those stockings went into a basin of ice-cold water. Not cool water, ice cold. The kind that made your hands ache if you held them under too long. The counterintuitive part is what makes this trick so interesting. Every instinct tells you that warm, soapy water is how you clean a delicate fabric. But warm water relaxes nylon fibers, and relaxed fibers are vulnerable fibers, prone to snags and runs, and the kind of distortion that means a stocking never quite fits right again. Cold water does the opposite. It shocks the fibers back into their original alignment, tightening the weave and resetting the shape. The stocking that went into the basin limp and slightly stretched came out firm and smooth, ready to be rolled gently and dried flat. It was physics, not folklore. Between 1951 and 1953, something shifted inside American closets that most women had not been prepared for. The post-war synthetic fabric boom arrived, and suddenly dresses were being made from nylon, polyester, and acrylic blends that behaved nothing like cotton or wool. They dried faster, they wrinkled less, and they cost less to produce. They also melted. Not dramatically, not in flames, but in the quiet, irreversible way that happens when a too-hot iron touches a synthetic weave and leaves a permanent shiny ghost of itself pressed into the fabric. Women had to learn entirely new care methods, and they had to learn them fast. The solution women arrived at was elegant in its simplicity. Between the iron and the synthetic fabric, you placed a damp cotton pressing cloth, a plain piece of muslin, or even a dampened dish towel, and you pressed through that barrier rather than directly onto the garment. The steam from the damp cloth did the work of relaxing the wrinkle, while the cloth itself prevented the iron's direct heat from reaching the synthetic fibers and scorching them. No shine marks, no melting, no ruined dress, just a crisp, smooth garment that looked as if it had just come off a department store rack. A damp cloth was all it took. Grease stains were the enemy of a well-kept wardrobe, and in a household where cooking happened 3 times a day on a real stove with real fat, they were also inevitable. The 1950s solution was immediate, and it worked on the same principle that expensive modern stain removers use today. The moment a grease spot appeared, women reached for talcum powder, dusted it generously over the stain, and let it sit. The powder absorbed the grease before it could bond permanently with the fabric fibers. Then it was brushed away, often taking the stain with it entirely. Fast, free, and remarkably effective. Now, an important note here, because this channel takes these things seriously. In the 1950s, they reached for talcum powder without a second thought. Today we know better than to keep talcum in the house. Modern research has linked certain talcum products to serious health concerns, and that is not something to wave away in the name of nostalgia. But here is the good news. Cornstarch does exactly the same job, the same absorption principle, the same application, the same result. Dust it on immediately, let it sit for several minutes, brush it away gently, the stain lifts, the trick survives, only the powder changes. Shampooing happened once a week in the 1950s, not once a day, which meant that in the days between washes, women needed ways to keep their hair looking clean and their scalp balanced. One of the most reliable tools was something every kitchen already had: white vinegar. After the weekly shampoo, a small amount of white vinegar diluted in water was poured through the hair as a final rinse, worked through from root to tip, then rinsed out with cold water. The hair dried with a smoothness and a shine that the shampoo alone never quite achieved, and it cost almost nothing. The chemistry behind this trick is the same chemistry that expensive pH balancing conditioners use today, just without the fragrance, the packaging, or the price. Shampoo, even a mild one, is alkaline. Alkaline products open the hair cuticle, which is exactly what you want when you are washing, but a raised cuticle reflects light poorly and catches on neighboring strands, creating frizz and dullness. Vinegar's mild acidity closes the cuticle back down, sealing the surface of each hair shaft smooth and flat. Flat cuticles reflect light evenly. That is the shine. That is the whole trick. A closed cuticle and a bottle of white vinegar. Pin curls were the architecture of the 1950s hairstyle, and the remarkable thing about them is that they required no heat, no product, and no electricity. Just water, a fine-tooth comb, and a box of bobby pins. A woman would dampen sections of her hair, weaned each section around her finger into a flat coil against her scalp, and secure it in place. Left overnight under a silk scarf or a hairnet, the curls set into the shape of the coil as the hair dried. By morning, the pins came out and the waves were there, soft and defined, without a single drop of setting lotion. The bobby pin itself had a technique that most people today have completely lost. When you press a single bobby pin across a curl, the open end can catch the wave and dent it, leaving a crease in the finished curl that no amount of brushing fully smooths away. The solution was to cross two pins in an X shape over each curl. The crossed pins distributed pressure evenly across a wider surface, held the curl more securely through the night, and left no single pressure point to create a dent. The result was a wave that came out clean and round, exactly as intended, every single time. They never wrote it down, but every woman knew. The crossed pin was not in any instruction booklet. It was not printed in the beauty column of McCall's or Ladies' Home Journal. It passed from mother to daughter at the vanity mirror, demonstrated with hands rather than words, learned by watching rather than reading. By 1954, the magazines had stopped covering basic hair-setting techniques entirely, on the assumption that this knowledge was already inside every household. And for a while, it was. What nobody planned for was the generation that grew up without a mother at the vanity mirror to show them how. Post-war dishwashing was not a small task. There were no automatic dishwashers in most American homes through the early 1950s, and 3 meals a day meant 3 rounds of standing at a sink with hot water and soap, hands submerged, scrubbing. The skin on a homemaker's hands took a daily beating that most people today would find difficult to imagine. The 1950s answer was a treatment so simple it sounds almost too gentle to work. Before bed, cold cream was rubbed thoroughly into the hands, working it into the knuckles and cuticles, and then a pair of thin cotton gloves was pulled on over the top. The gloves held the cold cream against the skin all night, preventing it from rubbing off on the sheets and allowing the oils to absorb slowly and deeply into the damaged skin while the woman slept. By morning, the hands that had spent the previous day in hot, soapy water came out of those gloves noticeably softer, the knuckles less raw, the skin less tight. It was the post-war homemaker's version of what today would cost $20 or $30 in a specialty hand cream with a French name on the label. Cold cream from a glass jar, cotton gloves from the five and dime, and 8 hours of sleep. Lipstick in the 1950s was not simply color. It was the finishing note of the entire vanity routine, the detail that pulled everything together, and women had strong opinions about how long it should last once applied. The trick that every woman used, though almost nobody today remembers it, was the blot. After applying the first coat, a single tissue was pressed between the lips and held for a moment, then pulled away. It removed the surface layer of wax and pigment, leaving only what had bonded directly to the lip itself. A second coat went on over that foundation, and the result was color that lasted hours longer than a single application ever could. She stood at the bathroom mirror, 1952, pressing a single folded tissue between her lips with practiced ease. It took 2 seconds, cost nothing, and it was the difference between a lipstick that lasted until noon and one that lasted until dinner. The blotting technique worked by removing the wet, oily layer on top of the pigment while leaving the stain behind. What remained was color bonded to the lip itself, not just sitting on the surface waiting to transfer onto every coffee cup in the house. There was a specific sound in a 1950s household that signaled something important was about to happen. It was the soft rustle of a silk scarf being drawn up over freshly set hair and tied snugly under the chin before a woman turned back to the ironing board or the kitchen sink. The scarf was not a fashion statement in that moment. It was armor. It kept the pin curls intact through hours of housework, protecting a set that had taken 40 minutes to create and had to last until Sunday. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes and think about it carefully. The whisper of silk against a bobby pin, the soft double knot pulled tight under the jaw. It was a ritual performed so automatically that most women could do it without looking up from whatever they were already thinking about. The scarf protected hours of invisible labor, the kind of labor that never appeared in any advertisement because it was simply expected, simply known, simply done. A sound that meant a woman was about to get to work. Here is one that costs absolutely nothing and requires only a damp toothbrush, the kind every woman already had on the edge of her bathroom sink. Before leaving the house in the 1950s, a woman would dampen an old toothbrush and use it to comb her brows upward and into shape. No gel, no wax, no pencil required. The damp bristles held the fine hairs in place for hours, and the result was the clean, defined brow that defined the decade. The beauty industry eventually replaced this free tool with a product that costs $14 and does the exact same mechanical job. The reason this trick vanished is almost painfully simple. There was no money in teaching it. A damp toothbrush is not a product anyone can sell you. By the late 1960s, brow grooming waxes and setting gels had entered the market, and the toothbrush trick quietly faded out of the passed-down knowledge that mothers gave daughters at the bathroom mirror. The trick did not stop working. It was simply replaced by something that came in a package with a price tag. It still works today exactly as it did in 1952, and the toothbrush is already in your bathroom. The 1950s complexion trick that nobody talks about anymore involved a single-ply tissue and a powder puff, used in a very specific order. After applying liquid foundation, a woman would lay one layer of tissue paper over her entire face and press gently. Then she powdered over the tissue before lifting it away. The tissue pulled off the excess foundation that would have settled into fine lines and caked by midday, leaving only the thinnest, most even layer behind. The result was the matte, natural-looking skin that made 1950s women look like they were wearing almost nothing at all. The result of that tissue trick was something the beauty industry has spent decades trying to replicate in a bottle. That poreless, lit from within look that you see in photographs of women from that era was not a filter, and it was not a particularly expensive foundation. It was a technique. Less product on the skin meant the skin itself showed through, and skin that had been cleansed with cold cream rather than stripped with harsh soap tended to look calm and even on its own. The flawless 1950s complexion was largely a matter of what those women did not put on their faces. There is a persistent misconception about 1950s beauty that is worth addressing directly because it shapes how people think about the whole era. The assumption is that women of that time wore heavy, theatrical makeup every day, caked on and elaborate. The reality is almost the opposite. The daily vanity routine for the average homemaker was strikingly minimalist. Cold cream to cleanse, a light powder, a single coat of lipstick, and perhaps a touch of mascara. The dramatic looks you see in advertisements and films were exactly that. Advertisements and films, not the bathroom mirror at 7 in the morning. Now here is one that sounds like a kitchen accident, but is actually one of the most chemically sensible tricks in the whole list. Women in the 1950s would rub the inside of a banana peel across their leather shoes before buffing them to a shine. The peel left a faint residue that softened and conditioned the leather, while the natural sugars gave it a base sheen that the buffing cloth could then work up into a real polish. It was free, it was always available, and it worked on everything from everyday flats to the good Sunday shoes that had to last for years. The chemistry behind this trick is straightforward enough that it is worth explaining because it transforms what sounds like a folk remedy into something that makes real sense. Banana peels contain potassium compounds and natural oils that penetrate the surface layer of leather and replace some of the moisture the leather loses over time with wear and exposure to air. Commercial shoe creams work on a very similar principle, using lanolin or mink oil to do the same conditioning work. The banana peel was simply the version that cost nothing and came from the fruit bowl rather than the hardware store. The dress shield is one of the most practical inventions in the history of American clothing care, and it has almost completely disappeared from modern wardrobes. It was a crescent-shaped piece of fabric, sometimes cotton, sometimes a thin, rubberized material that was either sewn or snapped into the underarm of a dress. It caught perspiration before it could reach the garment itself, which meant the dress could be worn many more times between washings without showing any sign of wear at the underarm. In an era when a good dress represented a significant portion of the household clothing budget, this was not a luxury. It was standard practice. The economic logic behind the dress shield was exact and deliberate. Families in 1950 were spending roughly 11.5% of their annual income on clothing and shoes, which made every garment a genuine financial investment. A dress shield cost only a few pennies and could extend the wearable life of a dress by dozens of additional wearings before laundering became necessary. Laundering itself wore fabric down over time, so every washing avoided was a direct extension of the garment's life. The dress shield was not about vanity. It was about protecting an investment the way you would protect anything else of real value in the household. Cedar blocks in a drawer have a smell that is almost impossible to describe to someone who did not grow up with it. It is sharp and dry and faintly medicinal, but in the most comforting possible way. In post-war American households, that smell meant one specific thing: someone was taking care of the Woolens. Cedar contains natural oils that are toxic to moth larvae, which are the actual culprits that eat holes in stored sweaters and coats. The blocks were placed directly in drawers and storage trunks alongside folded woolens, and they worked without any chemical spray, without any smell that transferred to the clothing itself, and without any cost beyond the initial purchase of the blocks. The smell of cedar in a drawer was one of those sensory signatures of a well-kept post-war home that you either remember or you have heard described by someone who does. It was the smell of a woman who had learned, probably from her own mother, that wool was worth protecting. Mothballs were the alternative, and they worked, but the chemical smell they left on clothing was unmistakable and unpleasant. Cedar offered the same protection with none of the residue. Women who knew this trick chose cedar without hesitation, and the blocks could be lightly sanded when their scent faded to release fresh oil from the wood beneath. The attic remembers, even when we forget. Right now, in attic trunks and cedar chests across this country, there are cedar blocks that have been sitting quietly for 60 or 70 years, still faintly fragrant, still doing the job they were placed there to do. The women who put them there are mostly gone, but the knowledge they acted on is still present in the wood itself. That is the thing about these tricks. They did not require anyone to write them down because they were embedded in objects, in habits, in the arrangement of a drawer. The trick survived in the cedar, even after the woman who knew it did not. The hand-rolled hem is one of those techniques that separates a garment that moves beautifully from one that merely hangs. In the 1950s, women finishing a lightweight skirt or a chiffon blouse would roll the raw edge of the fabric between their fingers, press it flat with a warm iron, and slip-stitch it by hand rather than running it through a machine. The result was a hem so thin it was almost invisible, and it allowed lightweight fabrics to fall and swing with a fluidity that a bulky machine hem simply cannot achieve. It took longer. It was worth it. The difference a hand-rolled hem made to the way a skirt moved was not subtle. Dior's full-circle skirts of the late 1940s and early 1950s were designed to swing and float, and that movement depended entirely on the hem being light enough not to anchor the fabric. A machine-stitched hem adds a small but real weight and stiffness to the bottom of a skirt. A hand-rolled hem adds almost nothing, so the fabric behaves the way the designer intended, responding to every step. American homemakers who could not afford a dressmaker learned to do this themselves, and the result was a skirt that moved like something that cost twice what it did. Trick number 25 is one of the simplest on the entire list, and it is the one that McCall's magazine stopped printing by 1954 because it was assumed that every homemaker already knew it without being told. Before putting any garment into the wash tub or the new electric washing machine, you turned it inside out. That single step protected the surface color and texture of the fabric from the mechanical abrasion of washing, kept buttons and trimmings from catching on other items, and prevented the outside of the garment, the part everyone saw, from fading prematurely. It cost nothing and added perhaps 4 seconds to the laundry routine. The fact that McCall's and Ladies' Home journals stopped printing these basic care tips by the mid-1950s tells us something important about how this knowledge was transmitted and how it eventually disappeared. The magazines stopped printing them not because the tricks were outdated, but because they assumed the knowledge was universal, passed down so reliably from mother to daughter that printing it would feel condescending. That assumption held through the 1950s. But when the post-war prosperity of the 1960s made replacement cheaper than maintenance, the passing down slowed, then stopped, and the magazines had already stopped printing the backup. When you look at all 25 of these tricks together, a single pattern emerges that is impossible to miss. Every one of them is built on the same foundational idea, that a thing worth owning is a thing worth tending. The cold cream, the cedar blocks, the penny in the hem, the tissue blot, the inside-out wash. None of them required money. All of them required attention. These women were not performing domesticity for anyone else's benefit. They were practicing a quiet, disciplined form of material intelligence that kept fewer things looking better for longer. And they did it as naturally as breathing because it had been taught to them the same way. Picture her now, a woman in her early 40s, standing in the bedroom doorway on Christmas morning in 1959, smoothing the front of a blue wool dress she had owned for 15 years. Her daughter, watching from the hallway, assumed it was new. The collar was crisp. The color was deep and even. The brooch at the neckline was different from last year's. Nothing about that dress looked like a garment that had lived through a decade and a half of holiday dinners, Sunday services, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. The secret was not money, and it was not luck. She starched that collar every single time before she wore it. She hung the dress with exactly 1 inch of breathing room on either side on the rod. She swapped the brooch, changed the belt, and once pinned a velvet ribbon at the waist just to see how it looked. The dress never had a chance to look tired because she never gave it the opportunity. Every wearing was followed by care, and every care was followed by deliberate storage. That was the whole system. What strikes me most, the longer I spend with this material, is that these women were not performing domesticity for anyone's approval. There was no audience for the moment you crossed your bobby pins in an X, or rinsed your stockings in ice water at 11 o'clock at night, or pressed a tissue between your lips to set your lipstick before you left the house. Nobody was watching. These were private acts of discipline, carried out because the woman doing them understood that a thing worth owning was a thing worth tending. That is a different kind of intelligence than we usually talk about. Here is the thing that makes this history genuinely unusual. These tricks were not written down in any comprehensive way. By 1954, magazines like McCall's and Ladies' Home Journal had stopped printing the basic care instructions entirely because the editors assumed that every woman already knew them. They were passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, demonstrated at the kitchen sink or at the vanity mirror, absorbed through watching rather than reading. There was no manual. There was only the woman standing next to you who already knew how. What broke that chain of knowledge was not carelessness, it was prosperity. As the late 1950s rolled into the 1960s, post-war manufacturing made replacement genuinely cheaper than maintenance for the first time in American history. A new dress from a department store cost less in real terms than it ever had before. When replacement became the easier option, the tricks that made the old dress last stopped being taught because nobody needed them urgently anymore. The economic pressure that had made every soap sliver worth saving simply lifted, and the knowledge went quiet with it. What we lost when these tricks stopped being taught was not just the tricks themselves. That would have been manageable. What we actually lost was the underlying mindset that a thing worth owning is a thing worth tending, that a garment is not a disposable object but a small investment that responds to attention, that your hands and a bar of soap and a bowl of cold water are tools as legitimate as anything sold in a bottle. When that mindset went quiet, we did not just forget how to care for clothes. We forgot a whole way of relating to the things we own. Every single one of the 25 tricks we have covered today costs nothing. Not a few dollars, not a subscription, not a trip to a specialty store, a bowl of ice water, a sliver of dried soap, a penny from your change jar, a silk scarf already sitting in your drawer, bobby pins you already own, the inside of a banana peel, a single tissue pressed between your lips. These are not budget alternatives to the real thing. For the women who used them, these were the real thing, refined over years of daily practice until they worked as reliably as anything money could buy. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. This video is not an argument that the 1950s were a golden age for women. They were not. The same decade that produced these clever, resourceful tricks also produced enormous constraints on what women were allowed to be and do and want. Both things are true at once. What I am offering here is not nostalgia for a perfect era. It is respect for the practical intelligence of real women who worked within the circumstances they had and found ways to do more with less. That deserves to be acknowledged on its own terms. If you are watching this and you are in your 50s or 60s, there is a real chance your mother or your grandmother knew every single one of these 25 tricks without ever thinking of them as special knowledge. She would not have called them a beauty regimen or a wardrobe system. She would have called it getting ready or taking care of things, or just what you do. The fact that it did not feel remarkable to her is exactly why it was never written down. It was the water she swam in, and now we are here, fishing it back out, one trick at a time. The research finding that stopped me when I first encountered it is this: these tricks did not vanish because they stopped working. They vanished because nobody was paid to keep teaching them. The beauty industry and the garment industry both grew enormously in the 1960s, and the products they sold were designed to replace the free knowledge that women had always passed to each other at no cost. There is no profit in telling someone to rinse their stockings in cold water or cross their bobby pins in an X. There is considerable profit in selling them a product that claims to do the same thing. Let me leave you with one last image. A woman in 1957 standing at her vanity in the early morning, the house still quiet before the children woke. She dipped her fingertips into the cold cream jar, worked it gently across her face, wiped it away with a soft tissue. She filled the basin with cold water and a handful of ice, bent forward, and held her face under for a count of 10. She dried off, crossed 2 bobby pins over the last curl at her temple, and tied her silk scarf over the whole set before she went downstairs to start the percolator. She never called it a ritual. It was simply what you did. She had not read about that routine in a magazine. She had watched her mother do it, standing in the doorway of her parents' bedroom when she was 8 or 9 years old, too young to understand what she was memorizing. By the time she was old enough to have her own vanity, her hands already knew what to do. She never called it a beauty regimen. She called it getting ready. And somewhere in that phrase, in the plainness of it, is the whole philosophy of how these women moved through their days, with attention, with economy, and without any fuss about it at all. These 25 tricks are a thread. Pull on any one of them and you find yourself connected to women who were more resourceful, more intentional, and more quietly skilled than the culture around them ever fully acknowledged. Women who made 30 garments look like 100. Women who kept a blue wool dress beautiful for 15 years through nothing but attention and care. Women who understood, without anyone telling them, that the most powerful beauty tool they owned was their own patience. The addict remembers, even when we forget. And it is worth going up there and looking around. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Somewhere in your memory, or in the stories your mother or grandmother told you, there is probably at least one trick from this list that you recognize. A habit, a small ritual, something she did without explaining why. I would love to know what it was. Leave it in the comments below, as much detail as you remember, because this channel exists for exactly that reason. Every story you share keeps one more piece of this knowledge from disappearing entirely. And if you found this video useful, please share it with someone who would appreciate it. The addict deserves to hear your stories too.